Axios published a series of articles, and they intended them to be hit pieces. You'll be able to tell. I'm going to read a little bit of it in a second. You'll be able to tell that it's a hit piece based on its tone and its foreboding language. But the reason, the topic of these hit pieces was something called Schedule F. It's an executive order that President Trump signed in October of 2020, right before the presidential election. And Schedule F was an effort to combat the administrative state by looking at these bureaucrats from a different perspective, looking at the bureaucrats less like the problem resided at the top of each agency, that it's not just the cabinet secretary or the 5 or 10 people who serve directly underneath them, but looking at this massive number of people who work in civil service jobs, these protected jobs. So maybe these sort of nameless, faceless people that we never hear about because they're not high enough level that they're being reported on or talking to the media. But these are the people that actually execute on the administration of each and everything that happens at these executive agencies. And so what Schedule F, this Schedule F executive order was supposed to do was allow the President of the United States to reassign a large number of these employees in the administrative state to something called a Schedule F employee. And a Schedule F employee would be designated as a political employee, which would then allow the president to fire that person at will, versus where it stands right now. The president can look at somebody in an agency, even a cabinet secretary can look at someone within their own agency that's doing a poor job. Maybe they're not even being political. There's basically no way to fire them. This executive order would have allowed the president to designate a much larger number of people as political appointees so that then the president could hire them based on their qualifications for the job versus other preferences, or fire them based on them doing a poor job. So that's just a tiny bit of background on Schedule F. We'll get into it in a little more depth in just a minute. But Axios ran a series of hit pieces on President Trump's executive order, and they're acting like it didn't happen already, like it would only be something for Trump's second term. But I want to read a little bit of this article. This is what it's called. It's called A Radical Plan for Trump's Second Term. And it's written by an Axios employee by the name of Jonathan Swan. This is what he writes. Former President Trump's top allies are preparing to radically reshape the federal government if he is reelected, purging potentially thousands of civil servants and filling career posts with loyalists to him and his America First ideology. People involved in the discussions tell Axios. The impact, Swan writes, could go well beyond typical conservative targets, such as the Environmental Protection Agency and the Internal Revenue Service. Trump allies are working on plans that would potentially strip layers at the Justice Department, including the FBI, and reaching into national security, intelligence, the State Department, and the Pentagon, sources close to the former president say. I love the foreboding tone that he writes in, as if this is like a bad thing. This is the heart of the swamp. He writes, during his presidency, Trump often complained about what he called the deep state. The heart of the plan is derived from an executive order known as Schedule F, developed and refined in secret over most of the second half of Trump's term and launched 13 days before the 2020 election. By the way, it wasn't like developed in secret in the sense that it was developed with some nefarious purpose. It required any kind of restructuring of the executive branch is slow. This is a very tortoise-like apparatus, and these changes have to be very legalistic, very nuanced, very detailed. This was not something that was concocted in secret in a back room somewhere. That's Congress. That's what happens in Congress. President Trump simply wrote this executive order and then, yes, issued it. And it took too long, of course, but what doesn't in Washington, D.C.? He goes, as Trump publicly flirts with a 2024 comeback campaign, this planning is quietly flourishing from Mar-a-Lago to Washington, with his blessing, but without the knowledge of some people in his orbit. Trump remains distanced by his obsession with contesting the 2020 election results, but he has endorsed the work of several groups to prime an administration in waiting. Personnel and action plans would be executed in the first 100 days of his second term, starting on January 20th, 2025. Their work could accelerate controversial policy and enforcement changes, but also enable revenge tours against real or perceived enemies and potentially insulate the president and allies from investigation or prosecution. And this is where he really gets unhinged here, because if the president is the chief executive, which he is, and presides over the executive branch, which is staffed with people who are completely ideologically opposed to the president and actually actively work to stymie his work, the president should have a right to fire those people. And it's not some kind of revenge tour. It's not some kind of retaliation. And it doesn't insulate the president from what? Like, why would you need to prosecute or investigate the president? He should be able to fire the people who works with him. That's how it works in any company. That's how any functioning apparatus works, that the person in charge is able to hire and fire people who are able to help him achieve the goal, help him achieve the agenda of whatever apparatus it is, in this case, the government.